Whew. Hi. Whew. Hi. Whew. How do you feel about tomorrow, Madison? You did. You sounded really nice. Yes, go right ahead. Hi, Hunter. Hunter, you sounded so great. So impressed. How do you feel about it? Are you ready, excited, nervous?
I feel ready.
Yeah.
A little bit nervous, like I was shaking.
Yeah. Yeah, just performance anxiety. I think y'all sounded really good though.
Thank you. Really appreciate
Where are my gals? Here comes Kenzie. Hi. Kinsey and Kayla. Hi.
Hi,
How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Kinsey, do you want to see what your medal looks like, or do you want to wait and be surprised?
Yeah, I want to see what it looks like. Oh my god.
I have peaches up here. What do I do with it? It's the exact same, except it says,
Valedictorian.
and hers says salutatorian. It's literally like, it looks like something the Wizard of Oz gives.
Oh my god.
I know. I really don't remember them being this big the first time.
That is so fancy.
Very fancy. I don't even remember actually if I guess we had them last year. Yes, ma'am. Let me just check. Okay, let me just double check. Fences. Gosh, there's so many things here. Drama research essay. Here we go. It did, yes. Perfect. Like a bat out of hell.
I uploaded mine, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now I'm like questioning myself.
Now everybody's good.
Perfect.
Oh, well, I'm glad that worked. I felt bad. I mean, like, you emailed me like 2 minutes apart or something. So like, I wasn't worried about you, but there were a lot of people who emailed me about different things, and they were like, sorry, I'm late for class or something. I'm like, well, I told you that I wasn't gonna be here, but also this is not important anymore. And then yesterday, Darling emailed me and was like, I'm so sorry. I forgot that we had to change the schedule and I need Madison during 7th period. Like, genuinely my bad. I'm so sorry. I should just quit now. And I emailed her back today. I was like, literally no worries. Like, all she had to do is turn in an essay, and she did. And she was like, oh my God, I thought you were answering me because you were mad. I'm like, no, you're totally fine. Don't answer emails for a day and people think you're not their friend anymore. All right, let me get plugged in here. Maybe. Yeah. All right, we're gonna start poetry today. There's not a ton today, but one of the things is sort of long, so we'll see how far we get in it. I mean, we should be able to finish. I wish that when I went from screen to screen, it would keep my proportions, and it doesn't. And that is infuriating to me. Okay. Tomorrow we'll look at the final project that you're going to be doing, but we're not going to worry about it today. In fact, maybe I'll put it off until Thursday, just because, oh, hang on, English 102. I may or may not put it off until Thursday just because Battle of the Bands people will, y'all won't be in class tomorrow, will you? Okay. And I'd rather, if I'm going to go over a project, I'd rather have everybody here. Okay. Ooh, I should, no, Julius is physically present. Doop, doop, doop. Okay. But all this poetry stuff starts in week 10, part 2. Don't know why it's divided that way, but here's this fun little Boromir meme. One does not just simply do poetry, you have to feel the poetry. One of the times Bryce Tomlins and I got maddest at each other, like genuinely, we were both so frustrated, was because he was trying to get me to tell him what poetry is. And I was like, you know what it is. Like, you recognize it when you see it. You don't not know what poetry is. And he was just like, but like, what is it? And it was to the point where I was like, are you just messing with me right now? Like, you know it when you see it. And he's like, I don't know. He's like, I don't know how to tell you how to help me. And also like he's who what? He would. He thinks he won't, but I bet he will. Okay, so let's talk about reading poetry. This is obviously not my point of view. This is someone else wrote this. For years, students have told me that they approach the poetry section of English 102 with dread. They seem to feel secure about reading plays or short stories, but poetry intimidates them. Maybe that's because we English teachers sometimes present poetry as if it's an elaborate code that must be cracked. I do feel that, even though I didn't write this, I do feel that way. In this class, I'm going to try to stay away from the attitude that a poem is a complex group of symbols that you must decipher. Instead, I'm going to try to get you to begin by paying close attention to the literal level of the poem before you make any statements at all about what the poem means. If you skip the plain meaning of the poem, it's hard to understand it at all. That is true. If you're too focused on looking for a deeper meaning, you might miss a really obvious meaning. In my attempts to avoid the mysteriousness of poetry, I'll be focusing on the concreteness of the poem, the pictures and the sounds it creates. These pictures and sounds are usually plainly described, but they do require you to pay very close attention to the words. Like all writers, poets like words. They like the way they sound when spoken, the way they sound when strung together, and they like the physical sensations words can stimulate in their readers' minds. If you simply listen to the sounds of word combinations and see, smell, touch, taste, or hear in your mind what the words describe, you will have understood a great deal about a poem without even discussing symbolism or meaning. In fact, for some poems or some readers, the primary meaning of the poem may be its ability to make us appreciate these pictures and sounds. I wonder if that's why they're choosing to have us look at Hamilton lyrics first, because there is some good, like, I don't know, I haven't looked closely enough to know if there's a lot of symbolism, but it is like really pleasant sounding poetry. Like really good rhymes and alliteration, just like really nice turns of phrases. But I would guess that most of it, having only seen it one time, is pretty literal. So maybe that's the reason they want us to start there. What I've just described can be summarized with the following terms, some of which will be familiar to you. Imagery, obviously. We went over imagery in the short story section, and it's anything that appeals directly to the five senses. Diction, which is just basically word choice. If a writer describes a person as sharp-eyed, he makes us see her as bright and interested, which are appealing traits. If, however, he chooses beady-eyed, we see the character as cruel and dishonest. It's all about word choice and connotations of different words. When we study poetry, we'll want to pay close attention to the implications of the words the poet chooses to use, always remembering that the words were in fact specifically chosen. Meter. Now this is one that we have not talked about in short stories, and it might have been a couple of years since you talked about meter at all. It is sort of a difficult thing to teach, but it's part of the musical nature of a poem. So we're going to try here to explain it in words. It says see the definitions for foot in your text, but we don't have a text. So basically meter is rhythm. It's the way the words rise and fall in a poem, or the way a reader stresses some syllables and weakens others. It's so natural that you don't even really notice yourself doing it. But studying it rarely feels natural to students. It seems pretty artificial and contrived, actually. But just as musicians work out the rhythm of their music, poets often take a great deal of time with the meter of their poems. So when you are figuring out meter, go by syllables, not whole words. And this is something that's always been tough, actually, to teach, just like what syllables are stressed in any given word. And I don't know why that's so difficult, but I think it's because we're not thinking about that actively, like when we're talking. And so, like, I remember teaching like Shakespearean sonnets to ninth graders. I was like, okay, my last name, McClellan, what's the emphasized syllable? And they're all like, Nook. I'm like, no, like, which one has the most emphasis? Which one's like the loudest? And like, it can be hard because you don't think about what syllables you're accenting. But McClellan, the second syllable, is the emphasized one. So there are several basic meters in English. This is not all the different kinds of meters. There's a lot of different ones actually. But an iambic foot is 2 syllables, unstressed, stressed in that order. For example, away. If you tried to say it with the emphasis on the first syllable, it'd be like away. And that sounds weird and unnatural. And that's not like perfectly or anything, but we do sort of talk in iambic feet typically. Obviously, like not every word is iambic, but just generally, like that's the reason that so many poems and sonnets in particular use iambic pentameter, because it kind of mimics our natural rhythm of speech. Even then, like you kind of hear, like if you're paying attention, you can kind of hear it, like it mimics our natural rhythm of speech. Like it's natural. Trochaic is the opposite of that. 2 syllables, stressed and then unstressed, like lovely. You wouldn't say that's a lovely sweater you're wearing today. That would be weird. Anapestic is 3 syllables, unstressed, unstressed, stressed, like understand. And dactylic, which is 3 syllables, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, like desperate. I don't know that we're going to need to, I can't say for sure that we need to know those terms or don't, but I will let you know. Now I can't remember what the name of the thing is that my last name is. Like when you have unstressed, stressed, unstressed. I'm just going to Google it because now I'm curious. Unstressed, stressed, unstressed. What is that called? What is that called? I thought that was an anapest, but clearly I'm wrong. All right, I don't know. I'm not gonna spend the time trying to figure it out right now. Nobody cares except for me, and it's part of my job. So if you get confused, reverse the stresses, and you might be able to hear how strange it sounds if you put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. It's what my high school chorus teacher always said. It says, okay, now on to Hamilton. We're not going to go into Hamilton just yet. To have great poets, there must be great audiences. Walt Whitman. We're going to look at poetry terms, actually, and I have already downloaded this so I can make it bigger. How to read a poem in 9 easy steps. I wonder why they don't ever, it's always PDFs on D2L. It's never like a Keynote or Google Slide or anything. We don't, I'm just going to check and see if this textbook actually says things on those pages. Probably not. 730 to 734. This is such a gigantic book. No. I might have us look at some of this stuff a different day, but okay, I'm just gonna read to you for a second. I'm not gonna read like a million pages or anything, but just about reading and responding to poetry. Ways of reading poetry and reasons for doing so differ almost as widely as poems themselves, and in ways we can perhaps best appreciate by considering poetry's function in other times and places. They might be aware, for example, that medieval noblemen paid courtly bards to commemorate their achievements and thereby help them to maintain their own prestige and power. You might be surprised to learn that since 2007, millions of people across the Middle East have tuned in to watch Prince of Poets, a reality show in which poets, rather than pop singers, compete for audience votes. That sounds kind of cool. I would definitely watch that. There we go. Such phenomena might come as a surprise to us, simply because today, at least in the West, we don't tend to think of poetry as having great popular appeal or political potency. It's a lot of good alliteration there. Millions of us may be moved by the way hip hop artists use rhyme and rhythm to boast about or celebrate and sing themselves, to show us the danger and excitement of life on the streets, or even to get out the vote. Yet poetry seems to many of us a thing apart, something either to suffer, to cherish, or to simply be baffled and intimidated by, precisely because it seems so arcane, so different and difficult, so essentially irrelevant to the rest of our lives. Though one rarely hears anyone say of all fiction, either I hate it or I love it or I just don't get it. If you're like most people, you've probably said, thought, or heard someone else say at least one of those things about poetry. And I have heard more people say they hate poetry or don't get it than that they love it. So this chapter and the ones that follow welcome poetry lovers, but they neither require you to be one nor aim to convert you. But we want to demonstrate a few key points. Poetry itself isn't all one thing. Poems differ as much as the people who write and read them, or as much as music and movies do. They can be by turns goofy, sad, or angry. They can tell a story, comment on current events, or simply describe the look of a certain time of day. Deciding that you love, hate, get, or don't get all poetry based on your experience of one poem or one kind of poetry is a little like either deciding you love all music because Mozart moves you, or giving up on music entirely because you don't like Lady Gaga. I like the way they put that. That's a good analogy there. I hear loud teachers. A good poem is not a secret message one needs a special decoder ring or an advanced degree to decipher. Any thoughtful person who's willing to try can make sense of it, though some poems certainly do invite us to rethink our idea of what making sense might mean. Poetry is spoken to millions of ordinary people across the centuries and around the world, so at least some poems can speak to us too, if we give them and ourselves a chance. By the same token, even the most devoted, experienced poetry lovers among us can become better, more responsive, more thoughtful readers by simply reading more and different kinds of poetry, and by exploring, as the following chapters do, the various elements and techniques with which poetry is made. Another key point, people around the world have often turned to poetry to express their feelings and longings precisely because poetry is, in certain vital ways, distinct from other forms of writing. Each genre plays by its own rules and has its own history and traditions, so reading poetry effectively, like succeeding in a video game, does involve learning and playing by certain rules. Any one poem may open itself to multiple responses and interpretations, just as a game may allow you many ways of advancing to the next level. But in both cases, there are limits. Neither is a free-for-all in which anything goes. In both cases, too, some difficulty can be essential to the fun. A poem wouldn't mean anything if it could mean everything. And that kind of just goes back to like, I mean, I know that I've talked to y'all about like interpreting literature in certain ways, and like, you can't just pull anything out and say, well, this story means this. Like, you have to have a reason to back it up. And I think they're kind of aiming at the same thing there. Like a poem can't just mean whatever you want it to mean, but it might mean different things to different people. Another key point, the questions we ask of a poem and the techniques we use to understand it are simply variations of the same ones we use in reading fiction or drama. Indeed, some poems narrate action just as a short story does. Others work much like plays. And finally, poems aren't nearly as fragile as we take them to be when we worry about overreading or analyzing them to death. You can't kill a poem, but a poem does experience a sort of living death if it's not read, reread, and pondered over. This is very touchy-feely. Poems need you. Not only can they bear the weight of your careful attention, but they also deserve it. The best of them are, after all, the result of someone else's. William Wordsworth may have done much to shape our contemporary ideas about poetry when he famously described it as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. But his own poems were, like most great poems, the result of weeks, even years of writing and revision. And I think Mr. Cheek just gave me like a gigantic book of William Wordsworth poems. So, but what after all is poetry? This sounds really silly, I'm not gonna lie. Trying to define poetry is a bit like trying to catch a snowflake. You can do it, but at the very same moment, the snowflake begins to melt and disappear. With poems, as with fiction, one must always come up with particular examples that don't do what the definition insists they must, as well as numerous writers and readers who will disagree. Yet to claim that poetry eludes all definition is merely to reinforce the idea that it's simply too mysterious for ordinary mortals. Without being all sufficient or entirely satisfying, a dictionary definition can at least give us a starting point. Here are two such definitions of poetry. I wish I had this last year when I was talking to Bryce about it. Writing that formulates a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience in language chosen and arranged to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, and rhythm. That's what the Merriam-Webster dictionary says. And the Oxford English Dictionary says, composition in verse or some comparable pattern arrangement of language in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style and rhythm, traditionally associated with explicit formal departure from the patterns of ordinary speech or prose, for example, in the use of elevated diction, figurative language, and syntactical reordering. So those definitions are different, but they both stress four elements: the patterned arrangement of language to generate rhythm and thereby express and evoke specific emotions or feelings in a concentrated way or with intensity. So that's all that we're going to look at from the book. Hopefully that's at least somewhat helpful to you guys. Print out these slides. We don't need to print it out. You have access to all these. Okay, so when you're reading a poem, this is like how to read a poem in 9 easy steps. Always read a poem aloud to yourself first and listen to the sounds. Read it through once without worrying about what it means. Poets tend to choose evocative words for their sound as well as their meaning. And sometimes the meaning of a poem is all about the feeling that certain sounds or words evoke. And it doesn't really go that far beyond just what the words sound like. Articulate your expectations starting with the title. So like read the title and figure out like, what am I expecting from this? What do I think it's about? Poets like to surprise their readers. Take note of what you expect and where, when, and how the poem does or doesn't fulfill your expectations. For example, so tired of wearing this mask. For example, the title of the poem, On Her Loving Two Equally, makes me think the poem will be about a woman. I don't know this poem actually. Can someone really love two equally? Maybe the question in the poem, maybe this is the question the poem will ask. I assume the answer is no, because I don't think this is possible. If so, maybe the title is sort of a pun on her loving two equally. Maybe that's just this person's expectations. That's not necessarily what the poem is about, but what they think it might be about. Read the syntax literally. I don't know why literally is capitalized there. You cannot begin to understand what a poem means until you literally understand what's being said. That can be tricky because poets love inversion, which is a change in normal word order or syntax. We know about inversion from inverted syntax. Y'all learned that last year because Yoda is always using inverted syntax. He says things in reverse of how we would normally say it. Identify sentences, ignore line breaks, and look for sentences or independent clauses. Is there any punctuation to help? A poem's line breaks indicate thought groupings, but you usually don't stop at the end of each line. Like, I don't know what this is from, but if that's your 2 lines of poetry, you wouldn't read it. You did not do it with only a hat to cover your heart. You would read it like a sentence. You did not do it with only a hat to cover your heart. Reorder sentences. See if you can clarify the meaning by finding the subject, verb, and complement of each sentence. Replace each pronoun with the antecedent noun it replaces. For example here, Damon had never subdued my heart had not Alexis took his part. And if we wanted to like delve into that a little bit further, we would say Damon had never subdued my heart had Alexis took Alexis's part or Damon's part. I think you'd have to sort of look at the total poem to figure that one out. If you're looking at an older poem, like pre-20th century, see if you can translate it into modern prose. Define any words you don't know, add any implied words, see how modern you can make it and how understandable you can make it. Note any ambiguities in the original language. Are there words that might have 2 meanings or verbs that might have multiple subjects or objects? Sometimes that's intentional. Consult reference works. Use a dictionary to define unfamiliar or ambiguous words and look up allusions that you don't know. Step 5, figure out who, where, what, and who, where, when, and what happens. Who is the poem's speaker? And speaker is one that we always have a hard time with because if we're looking at a poem by William Wordsworth, a lot of times the answer I get for who's the speaker is William Wordsworth, and that's not always the case. Like sometimes it might be, but I'm trying to think of a poem that we would all know. I don't know. Actually, okay, I think last year I had you guys in AP listen to the Reba McEntire song Fancy, because that's what I always use for speaker versus author or writer or singer or whatever, because it's telling the story from Fancy's point of view, and it's a story about how she basically like had to become a prostitute in order to help her family and get money and leave her small town and stuff. But like that happened to Fancy the speaker, not Reba McEntire the singer. We know that. So that's the difference in speaker and author or writer or singer or whatever. Who are the auditors, if any, which is an imaginary listener within a literary work as opposed to the actual reader, like if the speaker is addressing someone in the poem. Are there any other characters? Where is the speaker? Where and when do the actions in the poem take place? What's the poem setting? What's the situation in the poem? What, if anything, literally happens in the poem? Not every poem has a plot. In fact, a lot of them don't. If the poem doesn't have a plot, then how do you describe its internal structure? If it's not telling a story, then it might be capturing a feeling or describing something or someone. If so, there's usually a kind of progression or development or argument. So how does that shift over the course of the poem? Formulate tentative answers to the questions. Why does it matter, and what does it all mean? Like, why should anyone other than the poet care about this poem? What issues or conflicts might be relevant to other people? Like, if you're looking at a love poem, that might be relevant to you if you have ever felt that way, or like if you hope to feel that way. How is each problem or conflict developed and resolved? And those questions will lead to the theme. Step 7, consider how the poem's form contributes to its effect and meaning. How is the poem organized on the page, literally? What are the poem's formal features? Does it rhyme? Does it use alliteration? Does it have a specific meter? And not every poem will. How does the poem's form and devices contribute to its meaning and effect? In other words, what gets lost if you translate the poem into modern prose? And that's one reason that I do recommend trying to kind of break it down and translate it into modern prose, because you might see why it's written the way it is. Step 8, investigate and consider how the poem both uses and departs from conventions, especially related to form and subgenre. This is when poets choose the form and devices to enhance or highlight what they're trying to say. For instance, anapestic meter, which is 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed one, like understand, is usually used for comic poems. So when poets use it in a serious poem, they're probably making a point. That's interesting. And step 9, argue. Discussion with others can expand your perspective and enrich your experience. Not everybody's going to agree on what a poem means or even what's going on in a poem. And it's good to kind of bounce ideas off of each other as to what you think. Okay, so now what? There are so many ways to write and talk about a poem. There's no reason anybody should ever say, in this class, anybody should ever say, I just don't get it. So talk about how it makes you feel, what it sounds like, literary devices and how they're used, the plot, tons of options. Ooh, okay. Some important poetry terms. The pen flew across the page. Metaphor. A lot of these we'll know what they are already. We're just kind of reviewing since we're going to start getting into poems. Metaphor is a direct comparison between 2 unlike objects, like my love is a fortress. Simile is a comparison of two seemingly unlike things using like or as. It's a type of metaphor, such as my love is like a red, red rose. Personification is giving human traits to non-living objects, like the waves spoke to me. No, they didn't. You just interpret it that way. Rhyme, you know what rhyme is. Repetition of identical or similar sounds in two or more different words. Alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds, usually at the beginnings of words, like Greta Gruber grabbed a group of green grapes. Nice. Assonance is maybe a little bit less common, but that's the repetition of vowel sounds. It's kind of almost like the opposite of alliteration. So an example there, fleet feet sweep by sleeping geeks. And it's got that repetition of the E sound in the middle of every word. Apostrophe, not like the hook in the air apostrophe. An apostrophe is when an absent character or a personified force or object is addressed directly as if it were present or could comprehend. The example I always use is Juliet, when she's about to kill herself, she talks to her dagger. She says, "Oh, happy dagger, this is thy sheath, there rust and let me die," and stabs herself. She's addressing this thing that doesn't really, I mean, it exists, but it can't respond, it can't hear. She's kind of personifying it. Hyperbole is an intentional overstatement, like I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, or I always use hyperbole. You probably don't always. Imagery, we already talked about imagery. Repetition, just repeating words, phrases, or ideas. Oxymoron is a phrase combining two seemingly incompatible elements like crashing silence, old news, happy, grief, things like that. An archetype is an image or a symbol that's so common or important that it seems to have universal significance. So their examples here are lambs and snakes. When we think of a lamb, we think of like really innocent, gentle creatures or characters. And snakes, I mean, we literally tell people they're snakes if they can't be trusted. That's an archetype. Symbolism, something invested with significance beyond the item's literal meaning. Theme is the central idea of a piece. And irony is a discrepancy in levels of meaning. Verbal is if you say something where there's a discrepancy in what you said and what you meant. Situational is if there's a discrepancy in what happened and what was expected to happen. And dramatic is when the audience or reader knows something that the characters do not. Internal rhyme is a rhyme that occurs in the middle of a line. End rhyme is what we usually think of as rhyming, a rhyme that occurs at the end of the line. Imperfect or slant rhyme is words that don't rhyme perfectly together. Sometimes those are my favorite kinds, like groaned and ground. It's close, but not quite there. A perfect rhyme is words that rhyme perfectly, amazing, like how now brown cow. And to identify rhyme, we use letters. And this is something that, again, probably it's been a couple of years since you've done it, but using like A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, that kind of rhyme scheme. And if that gets confusing, we'll go back over that. A stanza is basically the paragraph, or like the poetry version of a paragraph. It's a unit within a larger poem. Common stanza forms include the couplet, that's 2 rhyming lines, a tercet, that's 3 rhyming lines, a quatrain, 4 lines, they might all rhyme, it might be A, B, A, B, a sestet, which is 6, and an octave, which is 8. Closed form is with the poetic structure has a recognizable rhyme scheme, meter, or stanzaic pattern, like a sonnet. A sonnet has very specific rules that it goes by. A villanelle has very specific rules, a haiku. Open form makes use of varying line lengths, abandoning stanzaic divisions, breaking lines in unexpected places, and even dispensing with any pretense of formal structure. It's basically no rules, anything goes. And our last couple, meter. It's a regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, each repeated unit of which is called a foot. Like I said, I haven't really looked that much at the Hamilton stuff yet, so I don't know if they, since it's since it's songs, I would assume there's some sort of regular meter. It might not be as regular as some songs, but I think it's going to be pretty regular. I know we're going to read The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, and that's definitely got a specific metered pattern. And then we have elision, which I'm not going to lie, it's a new word to me, which is leaving out an unstressed syllable or vowel. I never knew what this was called, usually to keep a regular meter. So like if you use or instead of over, or ne'er instead of never, that came up in something earlier. That's called elision. That's a brand new word for me. Okay, so the only other thing I had on the docket today, I think I am actually going to wait on, because this is about how to do parenthetical citations for poetry. And I'd rather wait on this until after I give you the assignment, the project, because it'll be more relevant. So that's it for today. Any questions you guys have about any of that? I'm not gonna lie, I don't yet know what's on the poetry quizzes, but I will take a look in advance. Your first quizzes that you'll have to do are Hamilton quizzes. I'm gonna take a look anyway. Not right now, I'm gonna let you guys go, but I'll take a look so we know what to prepare for. All right, I will see you guys tomorrow. Most of you guys tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.